Welcome back to Renegade Investor Academy, where we look at what's happening in the financial and the investing world and how it needs to impact your thinking about your portfolio. Now, in the last few weeks, there's something that's kind of slipped out somewhat under the radar screen, but is actually enormous news, possibly the biggest news in the financial world since the end of the Second World War. That's when we entered into a system called Bretton Woods. And this was effectively the end of the gold standard and the beginning of the dollar standard, where all of the world's central banks agreed that they would peg their currencies to the dollar, and then they also agreed some little maneuverings they could get up to if they got into any financial difficulties. Eventually, it also gave birth to things like the IMF and the World Bank. They have now come out and said, the IMF, that they want to have a major system reset. Effectively, it's kind of Bretton Woods 2.0 for this 2020s onwards era. And this could set the tone and the structure and the workings and the plumbing of the world's financial system for the next 30 or 40 years. This is enormous. But it's one of these things that it's an opportunity and it's a threat. Some people are saying this could be as big as the internet in terms of its impact on our lives. What I want to try and do here, I can't give you all the answers and all the detail because this is still emerging and developing, but I just want you to be aware that something big is going on. Now, one of the potential fallouts of all of this is almost kind of the opposite of what we're seeing with Bitcoin and the crypto world. Because if you remember, one of the big incentives, one of the big attractions about Bitcoin and blockchain is that it's independent of banks. It's direct to the other party. And it's transparent on a distributed ledger where you can follow transactions all around the world. Oftentimes in the real kind of mainstream financial system, you don't even know who the counterparty is. Some of these bonds get recycled 20 or 30 times, so you never know where the risk lies. If you recall the global financial crisis in 2008, part of the problem was that all of those mortgages were being pushed together and to MBSs, mortgage-backed securities, that then got sold out as high-quality investment debt. And the reality was, of course, most of them were junk from people who couldn't pay their mortgages. But you didn't know who the counterparty was when you bought that security. So that kind of transparency that gets offered by Bitcoin and blockchain was seen as really powerful. Well, now what I think we're going to see is a move towards a kind of equivalent of cryptos, but run by the central banks. They're called central bank digital currencies. Now, the first person to start the discussion around this was Mark Carney, the former governor of our own Bank of England. And it's really gathered momentum amongst his buddies in the international central banking world. So much so that in the US, the banks there have been told that they must be in a position to offer a digital wallet by January 2021. That's just weeks away. The European Central Bank has now said that it's going to make a decision on a digital euro also in January 2021. So as well as the US mandating its banks to provide that digital capability, we've also got the Bank of England that is very far advanced in its thinking on this. The ECB has actually announced that it will make a decision on this in January 2021. And of course, our friends over there in the People's Republic of China are probably, frankly, already way ahead of us. But there are some really major differences to the current model that this is going to bring in. And I did a short video about this recently, and I started getting comments like, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with digital currencies. It's really convenient that I can pay for things with my debit card and so on. That is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about potentially could actually cut out the banks completely, because at the moment, what we have is a great big international payment system called SWIFT. And when people are buying things perhaps from America overseas, their payments are being processed through SWIFT, And what that means is that in total, something like 79% of all global trade is in the US dollar. So we really are living in the world of the dollar system, the dollar as our reserve currency, the dollar as in Bretton Woods 1.0, replacing the gold standard as the central plank of international currency. But where does it go in the future? Well, if they actually resort to these digital currencies, we don't need SWIFT anymore. What we effectively will have is a direct account with the central bank. So never mind Barclays or NatWest or HSBC, this bank will issue the currency and we can then spend it. And you can imagine how attractive and how convenient that's going to appear. You can imagine how we could be incentivized to download the Bank of England app so we can start using BOE coins, and maybe they'll give us £100 of it for free. And that all sounds terribly good. But what people don't seem to realize is that these coins, these digital currencies, are actually pieces of code. They are programmable, which means that the central bank, and we have to assume from that the government, effectively has direct access to your bank account. So if they wanted to, some of the things they could do would be to very easily program negative interest rates. So if they want to say that because of all the developments, because of all the things we've had to do in the bond markets, all the things the government's spending, we're bringing interest rates down to -1%, they can just take that money straight out of your bank account. What about taxation? We all have these returns that we do each year that are getting more and more complex, but they're also getting more and more digitized and more online. So what's to stop them having a direct tax take from your bank account? We've just decided that capital gains tax is 45% instead of 18%. So you owe us 23%. Thank you very much. We'll take that. Direct taxation could come out. Now, here's the scariest thing of all. What if they take their lead from our friends in the People's Republic of China and implement a social credit score? So that if you were deemed to be a bad citizen, for example, if you dared to suggest that Boris Johnson was an incompetent buffoon who couldn't manage his way out of a paper bag, you might get a negative social credit score, and they might stop you from spending money on things, or even stop your universal basic income coming through. So, all the things that they give with this kind of currency, they can take away. So you could become effectively earmarked as a troublemaker. Maybe they might stop you buying airline tickets to travel somewhere. They might stop you spending money on things that they felt were inappropriate. The government can start doing all of these things. It is truly scary. It is truly dystopian. That's why I say that this is more dangerous than tanks on the streets. It is the end of privacy. It is the end of liberty if the government and the central banks can have this much control over our bank accounts, over our money, what we spend our money on, and all the rest of it. Because obviously linked to these digital coins will be the end of cash as we know it. So, cash already is a relatively small part of the economy. It's what we use for certain transactions. There's always this feeling that it's used in a black economy where people are trying to avoid tax and so on. You've got to imagine that somehow, some way, cash is going to get phased out. So central bank digital currencies become almost the polar opposite of cryptocurrencies. And what we're going to see, I think, increasingly is tension between the desire of banks and politicians to centralize and control everything versus the desire of savvy citizens to decentralize and have things away from government control. And the technology to do that is developing rapidly. It's called DeFi, decentralized finance. And it uses things called smart contracts, which again are programmable, and they can run across the Ethereum platform and effectively cut out the banks as middlemen. So these things become a very transparent way of doing business, a private way of doing business, and a global way of doing business. Because if you have access to the internet, you can have access to decentralized finance. And if you've tried opening a bank account recently, you'll know how hard it can be to get into the centralized system. If you've tried sending money around the world, it can be horrendous to get money from one country to another. I have a business and a residence in Montenegro. Every time I try and send money to my accounts in Montenegro, I get pushback. Oh, that country is on our list of whatever, and you have to provide additional security, additional documentation, just to send your own money to your own business in your own bank account in that country. I don't like that. I don't think that is a nice way of living. That's not the kind of society I want to be a part of. Now, there are some downsides to using decentralized finance. It's quite complicated still. There can be what you could call no safety net. If you send things to the wrong person, the wrong wallet or whatever, there's no way of claiming that back, such that you do have in the centralized system. It's also slower at the moment. Payments take longer to process than they do in the centralized system. But that is kind of teething troubles of where we're at this stage in the process. Those issues will be solved. What you can't solve is the growing desire for power and central control from our governments and the central banks. And I can see an enormous culture clash coming between those who want this centralized control and the citizens who want freedom, transparency, privacy, independence through the decentralized finance model. So all I want to do today is to get Bretton Woods 2.0 onto your watch list, because what this could spawn is the biggest change in the way the financial system of the world works for 75 years. Don't let this float under the radar screen. Learn about it, understand the implications of it, and then you can make plans to protect your future from central banks and central governments that want central control of every aspect of your life. I'll see you next time for another Renegade Investor Academy.